guys, thanks for tuning in. Just a quick story today and a little show and tell, perhaps a little instructional video and a cautionary tale, and shameless promotion of our product, all in one. We're gonna wrap this all up into one. I bought a motor on eBay. This gotta been almost 10 years ago. It was advertised to have cams and high compression pistons and a 6-speed gearbox and all the good stuff. And I thought, and the price was really good. So I called the guy up. He told me he was out in Arizona. He had some guy build it for him and for a project, and he kind of lost interest, or anyway, had a change of direction and was parting everything out. So the price was so right, it was like buying a stock motor. I'm like, just for the parts, I'll buy this thing and get the parts out of it. Dual valve spring head, Yosh cams, all the stuff, a lot of the stuff we do here. So I had this motor sitting on a bench for a long time. And as we're shuffling motors around, because we're constantly building new specs and testing stuff, I ended up with a bike that didn't have a motor in it. And now my boys are riding, and so I need all my bikes running, and so everybody has something to ride. So I was like, well, let's just grab that motor and throw it in. I don't even know if it runs. I was gonna just take it apart and steal parts out of it. So we threw it in the bike. It fired right up, sounded good. Went out and rode it right off the bat. I'm like, oh, it doesn't have a 6-speed in it. Well, but the gearing, our final gear ratio, something felt off. Felt like a close ratio 5-speed, and our final gearing was like our top speed, and cruising speed at like 70 in 5th gear with our final gear ratio was weird and not feeling right. And after riding it for a while, I told my son just a couple weeks ago, hey, we need to tear this thing apart. I have a feeling that they put a 6-speed gearbox in this thing and didn't put a 6-speed shift drum in it. So build tip number 1, if you're switching over to a 6-speed gearbox in your ZRX, there are many options, Kawasaki options to go with. The main thing you need to watch out for is the length of the output shaft. But you can buy offset sprockets. We've run 3 or 4 different lengths and different offset sprockets to make them work. So there are ways to get around it, even if you end up with a shorter shaft, something like that. But if you don't put a 6-speed shift drum in, you will still only be able to shift through 5 gears. And I'm gonna show you real quick here what that looks like. So this is your shift drum right here. I'm gonna go ahead and shift it just so you can see. I was gonna show you on the motor the difference in the shift drums, but I forget this thing. One of the things we do too is we take the first gear lockout in them. So for those of you who don't know what that is, it's in your stock ZRX gearbox as well. And they can fail, the balls get stuck, and then you go to shift for second and it makes like a half shift, and it'll round the dogs off in 2nd gear on the windows and the engagement dogs and basically ruin your gearbox. So when we build motors, we pull those out so there's no chance of that failing and getting like this half shift, because it basically, you can push on the shifter hard enough that it gets the tips over them, but it just spits it back out, and then it just wipes the corners off, and then you have no engagement. For today's tale, the 6-speed gearbox with a 5-speed shift drum. So a 5-speed shift drum, if you look at the path on the end of the shift drum, this is the easiest way to tell. They're very far apart, the end to the 2 ends. The other pathways are machined all the way around. On a 6-speed shift drum, do you see how close they come together? That's so it rotates one more position and kicks you into 6th gear. So without it, you end up with a close ratio 5-speed that feels kind of funky. And I've never seen it before, hadn't heard anybody doing it, but there's a first time for everything. And so once we got into this motor, and I'll tell you why we took it apart like we did. Once we got into this motor, we found a bunch of little things, and I'm just gonna go over them because if somebody's building a motor, maybe it'll help somebody down the road. And there are some little things that, you just need to pay attention to detail. That's what a good engine builder is, just really detailed. That's the big thing. And then after that, it's experience, understanding relationships and tolerances and clearances and compression ratio and cam timing and valve to piston clearance and all that other stuff. But anyway, so we got right off the bat, we found that. But the reason we ended up tearing this motor down is because we were out riding Saturday and my son was on the bike, and all of a sudden he wasn't behind me. So I pulled over, waited, didn't come, turned around, came back, find him pushing the bike down the side of the road. Asked him what happened. He said the motor made a really bad sound, and then he just shut it off and pulled in the clutch, coasted over the side of the road. My first thought was that it spun a bearing, which I thought was weird because we were just cruising down the road. We were on a country road, just cruising along, speed limit, maybe 5 or 10 over, and kind of putt-putting. And no high RPM, no hard downshifts, nothing like that. Stuff that motors tend to let go under those circumstances, if they're gonna let go. So anyway, I hit the start button because I wanted to hear, and I was just going to start it and turn it right off. And it instantly fired, and I could tell it fired on all four because it didn't hesitate, but it sounded like there was the bottom of a connecting rod or something bouncing around in the engine. It was horrendous. So I just shut it right back off. And was like, wow, that's crazy. And then the more I thought about it on our way home, I'm like, that's not a spun bearing. If it wasn't dropping a cylinder, it wasn't a mild rhythmic tick. It was more like a hand grenade. And so when we got home, we started pulling all the covers off. And when we pulled the clutch cover off, lo and behold, I had not updated this engine because we didn't have a tensioner, one of our tensioner blockout plates in it. And we were just cruising down the road, probably 4,000 or 5,000 RPM, steady state, and this thing decided to give up. When we found it, this was, in relationship to the clutch, this was turned, this was forward and all this was down. It was in there like that. So it had pulled everything past. It actually didn't do, I've seen worse in running bikes that haven't failed. Here, it didn't do too much damage, and we got lucky. It just snapped the one boss off for the clutch springs and ate a clutch spring. And that was it. And we haven't found any more damage related to that failure yet. So obviously, this is a great advertisement for our chain tensioning bow little lockout that we sell. We were selling them. We'd heard the stories. We'd seen some pictures of catastrophic failures like this, but way worse. And then we'd been seeing the witnesses where that we knew that the bow was getting into the pressure plate, and that's not okay. So we built a little block, it's on our website, that doesn't allow anything to return back far enough to interfere with this. It uses stock spring tension. In travel, you don't have to adjust it. You just put our block in, pin it, and clip it, and you're good to go for pretty much the duration of your motorcycle. As we're tearing it apart, go to pull the transmission cover off, and this thing always had a little oil leak, and I thought it was probably just around the shaft, the shift shaft seal, or the throw out rod for the clutch, and or the slave cylinders sometime will weep past the seal. But I'm always finding like a drop of oil, very rarely, but every now and then there'll be a drop of oil somewhere around this under the bike. What we found was whoever built this motor put this seal in backwards. And they don't work backwards. They are a directional seal. These lips in here, if this was turned around, the engine pressure pushes out and forces the seal out, and that's what helps create the seal. With it in there backwards, everything just wants to kind of blow by it when it's under pressure. And it does have two lips, one going each way. So it did a halfway decent job of sealing, but it wasn't working right because it was in backwards. So that was one of the things we found. Another thing we found was, when you put your oil pump in, you have one of the bolts that goes through and holds it this section is, if you look down in there, it's stepped, and there should be a dowel in there that locates it, because when it's lined up, you need it lined up really precisely, because there's engagement points to engage this side of the pump and this side of the pump. One is driven off the clutch in a gear that turns the pump, and the other end drives your water pump. So you don't want this thing moving around even a couple thousandths of an inch in there. You want it perfect alignment, and without the dowels in, that's a bad deal. And there's another dowel that goes in here that has a tiny little oil restriction hole in it and an O-ring. Always be sure to put that one in. So that's that. And then the last thing, well, actually it was one of the first things we found. The cams, rocker arms, all looked great. The whole top end looked good. We pulled the head off, and this is now the second motor we've seen with this particular piston kit in it that's done this, and I think I know why it's doing it. The first one that did this, instantly there was smoke blowing out the crankcase breather, oil smoke, like white smoke, and it was a customer's motor, and he called me and I said, man, that sounds like you hold a piston. Anytime you get white smoke out the exhaust or out the breather, that means there's oil burning in your combustion chamber and it's filling your crankcases up. But it also gets oil up, burns it, and pumps it out the exhaust. So you get white smoke out the exhaust and white smoke out your breather, because it's basically an open orifice. This motor, and that's when we tore it apart, that's what we found. A piece of the piston had broken off, and it had broken off in a manner that it actually created a small hole between the piston, the top and the bottom side of the piston, so you were getting that oil smoke. This motor never smoked a bit, and there's no way that this and the other I mean, it would be astronomical odds if it happened at the same time. On this, it was a little different. We don't believe there's a hole past the piston, but it broke parts of the piston, one of the pistons off above the top ring. And I'm going to show you what I think is going on, and just tell everybody that's running one of these kits just to keep an eye on it and be careful. I'm done with them. I will not, if I'm going to run a standard bore motor from now on, I'll just run ZZR pistons and do the machine work to get the compression ratio where we want it. We've done a bunch like that. It's a lot cheaper. It works great. I can get over 13:1 compression ratio doing it that way. And we haven't had any problems with those pistons doing that. But I think somewhere in the machining and the design of this piston, something got overlooked. I don't think it's an issue on the 1224 piston, because the piston's slightly larger. The ring groove is it's the same width ring. And so there's less overlap in the area. So there's more material, if that makes sense. And I'm going to show you what I'm talking about. So if you look closely right here, well, you don't have to look that closely, you can see, go up, you can see your top ring, and you can also see a little section of the top ring there. And if you look at the height of the ring in relationship to this back corner where the valve relief has been cut, there's not a whole lot of material thickness there. This pocket is cut back over the top of that ring, and so there's like, if you could look at a 3D drawing that was where you could actually, the materials were there but they're transparent, like on a 3D program. When you looked at that, you'd be able to see that there's just a very tiny bit of material in those because the intake pockets are much larger than the exhaust pockets. These hold up okay. I think there's enough material in there, but like if you look right here, there's like nothing. It goes all the way out to the edge of the cylinder, and then the piston dips down. So right in through here is just, it's the weakest point of the piston on the dome. Obviously, if these motors were detonating, that's going to be your failure point. The thing that we're seeing is when we look at the top of the pistons, the spark plugs, the combustion chambers, we're seeing no signs of detonation. These are relative, this is street motor. It probably doesn't have, 12 and a half, somewhere between 12 and a half, 13.1 compression. I didn't build this one, so I don't know, but the head's the right thickness. Head gasket seems to be the right. I haven't taken the block off yet. I don't know what they're running for base gasket, or if they are, or if they've decked the block. So there's a few things left that we still need to determine. But I know the other motor that did this exact same thing was a 12.5 to 1 motor, street motor. But this motor was set up super rich, and I don't think that it was detonating at all. I think, and to be honest with you, the crazy thing about this is, I think this has been like this for some time. I think that it did not, that top ringland, there's still some piston material on the back side of that ringland. It just broke those chunks off. The motor never smoked, never blew any smoke out the breather or the exhaust, because there was a rider behind Christian when this happened. And so I think this has been like this for a while now. And I think that basically the second compression ring has been sealing everything up, and we've been getting away with it. So I'll probably post another video once we get this torn down. My wife just came in here and said, hey, we need a video to post, and this would be interesting. I thought, well, it is. It sucks, but it is interesting. There's another thing I want to point out while we're in here. This is, whether this happened a long time ago or it just happened, I want to show you guys something, because we get into a lot of conversations about running unfiltered flat slides. So I'm going to drop the piston to bottom dead center, and I want to show you guys something. I want you to look around that cylinder wall.
No.
Okay. So I don't know how good that's going to show up on camera, but I can tell you there is zero damage to that cylinder wall, and large chunks of that piston are missing. The other thing that there's no damage to is the cylinder head. The cylinder head seals up perfect. There's not one sign that anything has hit in the combustion chamber. And this is a conversation we have a lot about running unfiltered carbs. People are worried about dust getting in and damaging their cylinder wall. Everything's happening so fast. The valves are opening and closing. There's basically a column of air moving through your intake port, across your combustion chamber, and out the exhaust, and it is taking everything with it. It's not coating the cylinder wall, and then the piston's not grinding that material into your cylinder walls. We've been running open carburetors since 1990 on our race bikes, our road race motorcycles, and our street bikes. And this is what I'll tell you. I build a lot of engines. We do a lot of freshening up on all our race bikes here, but we also play with a lot of different combinations. So we put motors together, run them, take them apart. We'll put a season on a race motor or a season on a street motor, and then pull it down over the off season just to do something different to it, and inspect some of the changes we made and some of the parts we're running. We want to see if we're running into any excess wear or any potential points of failure. Because if there's any chance, we don't want to sell that to a customer and have them have the inconvenience of an engine failure. And it's bad for me, it's bad for business. So we try to thoroughly test things, and I would never recommend running open carbs on anything if I didn't have 30 plus years of experience doing it. The bikes run better, they look cooler, there's all these other factors. I do tell people, if this is your only source of transportation, maybe don't do it. Maybe put a set of filters on them. Even though I've never had any problems, none of my customers have ever had a problem doing it, running them open. There is a chance that you could ingest something large that could chip a valve or a valve seat or bend a valve even, if the piston came up just at the right time. 30 years experience, never happened. We got hundreds of thousands of miles between myself and all of our customers running them this way, and it just doesn't seem to be an issue. I will say this, I've built every type of race engines, all the big 4 Japanese stuff, and Ducati, Triumph, you know, race motors and street motors. And based on piston design, skirt size, engine geometry, rod angle ratio, all these other factors, we see a lot of cylinders scoring and skirt wear and things like that looks terrible. And those bikes have an air box with an air filter. They're completely sealed up. It's more about how you're side loading things, and you know, like how is it driving the skirt into the side of the bore? Is it do you have such a small skirt on race pistons? Some of our race pistons have a skirt on each side that resemble the size of a postage stamp. And there's an advantage to that, but it comes at a price. You know, you're going to have premature wear. You're going to get more piston rock over time. You're going to collapse skirts more rapidly, and you're going to see it on the skirts and in the bores. But these pistons, and like everything with ZRXs, they're so overbuilt. They got huge skirts. The pistons are always perfectly aligned in the bore because they're so, you know, the skirts are long. They go all the way around the bore. You know, we've taken motors down that have over 100,000 street miles on them, and the bores look brand new. Like we put a bore gauge in them and they're perfectly round still. I mean, and there's no signs of wear, and on the skirt there's no sign of wear. I'm not saying that something can't happen. Absolutely it can, but we like running our carbs open. We've done it forever. We get lots of comments about it. It makes me laugh, so by all means keep saying stuff. Because I have a lot of experience doing this, and the guys making the comments, I'm pretty sure, don't know what they're talking about and don't have a lot of experience doing it. You know, it just is what it is. But anyway, so that's what we found so far as we move through more of this motor and get it further torn down. And I definitely will take some pictures of that piston once the rings are out. I'm pretty sure that piston still holds air on top of it. Oh, one more thing about the rings. So even though you can, you know, that one ring is exposed on the top, and that's an issue. Obviously, we don't want to run a motor like that. It can still seal. As long as there's not a hole getting into the underside of the piston, you have another ring down there that seals. We run our race pistons, our 1255 kit only has one ring. A lot of superbike pistons and race applications in cars and bikes and other things run a single ring piston because it's less friction. So you end up with less parasitic loss. Plus, on race engines, a lot of time we redesign the geometry of the motor to get better rod angle ratio. And when you do that, you usually, to get a longer rod end, one of the things you're going to do is move your wrist pin up in your piston and run a lower compression height. And to do that, a lot of times you have to get rid of one of those rings to create space for the wrist pin to move up. And then on the oil scraper rings, sometimes they're going across the wrist pin and you have to put support rails in to support the oil scraper ring at that point. Our race pistons on our 1255 are like that. We haven't sold any of those kits for the street because we're not sure what kind of longevity they have. When this motor came out, we put a 1255 in that bike. It is a street/track bike, and we are gonna go out and abuse the shit out of it and see what happens. And hopefully everything will hold up good. We already know it makes ridiculous amounts of power. Ridiculous. And if it'll even go 10,000 miles, with the kind of power it's outputting, it's a fair trade-off. It is well worth it. I'd build them all day long. Anyway, sorry about my rooster crowing in the background, but when I'm not building motorcycles, I'm a egg farmer. Anyway, thank you guys so much for tuning in and hanging out with us. We will keep you posted when we learn more about anything else that's happened here. Have a great day.